Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. Can you hear me and can you see the slides?
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm Elena Novelli from Base Business School, and as you mentioned today, we are presenting together with Chiara from INSEAD this paper. And we would like to first of all thank SMS for organizing this session. We are delighted to be here, and also I can see there are many friends in the audience. So thank you so much for taking the time to attend our presentation. We are really at a stage where we would certainly benefit from feedback and comments. So we look forward to hearing from you later. So this paper builds on the observation that innovation settings and entrepreneurial settings in particular are characterized by a high degree of uncertainty. So part of which is endogenous to firm action. So a very important question in these settings is how can firm navigate this uncertainty, and in particular, what kind of decision-making processes can help them navigate uncertainty. So if we look at prior research, there are essentially two main approaches that have been identified that can help firms navigate uncertainty. First of all, what we can call a cognitive-based approach. A cognitive-based approach is essentially based on the idea of addressing uncertainty by reasoning through theory, frameworks, or rules that can help decision makers understand what to do. Alternatively, decision makers can use what we could call evidence-based approaches. These approaches are essentially based on the idea of addressing uncertainty via the systematic collection of evidence and its discipline assessment, with the idea that in this way they can learn from the environment. Now, more recent evidence has suggested there are actually important synergies that exist between cognitive and evidence-based approaches. For example, the work of Kathy Eisenhardt and Chris Bingham suggests about the importance of combining thinking and doing to devise superior strategies. Or, for example, the work of Rory MacDonald and Kathy Eisenhardt shows that entrepreneurs who combine cognition with evidence, for example, using experimentation to test the key assumptions underlying a business model, can accelerate their learning. Or finally, the work of Camufo and colleagues shows the benefits of a scientific approach to decision-making, an approach that combines elements of cognition as well as elements of experimentation. So we use the terminology used by these authors, and we will talk about a scientific approach to decision-making to refer to an approach that uses theory, hypothesis, but then tests these hypotheses with evidence and conducts a disciplined evaluation of that evidence. The expression scientific approach refers to the fact that an approach that uses theory, hypothesis, evidence, and evaluation really resembles that used by scientists in the development of knowledge. Now, let me give you an example about how such an approach might actually work in practice, especially in the context of entrepreneurial decision-making. So here is an example of an entrepreneur we worked with. Essentially, this entrepreneur identified and developed a theory about the fact that there is actually some unmet demand in electronics that comes from non-tech savvy consumers. These consumers are really more interested in the usability of products, in the aesthetics of products. They don't really know the details about the technical specifications. So they know what they want to achieve, but they don't know exactly what technical specifications they need to achieve that. So this entrepreneur developed a theory about these types of consumers and how their demand could be met, and developed a set of hypotheses. An example of one of these hypotheses was, for example, that providing customers with information on product compatibility was more relevant when they were making a purchase than providing them with very detailed technical specifications. So they devised a set of tests for their hypothesis. And for example, in this case, they ran an online test, an A/B test, for 2 weeks, offering customers different product specifications. On the one hand, information about product compatibility. On the other hand, information about technical specifications of products. They found that their hypothesis was supported, and so they continued iteratively to test hypotheses about their theory until they reached a stage where they developed a very solid and robust value proposition that enabled them to grow and succeed. So that led me synthesize what a scientific entrepreneur is. A scientific entrepreneur is one who starts with a mental model that explains how a business creates value. He or she then proceeds to articulate, to decompose that theory into testable propositions that logically flow from the theory. They then perform rigorous tests with representative samples of customers, and then they assess the evidence collected in a disciplined way. If this is a scientific entrepreneur, who is then a non-scientific entrepreneur? A non-scientific entrepreneur is one who draws conclusions based on testing, but with no counterfactuals. Is someone who tests multiple versions of a product, but without being driven by a theory. Therefore, there is a higher degree of causal ambiguity. Or someone who performs lower quality tests. For example, multiple versions of a product or a service are tested, but they differ on more than one characteristics. So the signal that those tests can reveal is certainly more noisy. So the key research question that this paper addresses is to what extent and under what conditions is a scientific approach to decision-making, so as an approach that combines cognition and evidence, associated with superior performance. And in particular, what we want to understand is whether a scientific approach can benefit all firms equally. Now, we believe that this is a very important question, especially because the main evidence that has identified a positive relationship more in general between systematic decision-making approaches and performance tends to be focused on more established firms. So we want to understand this question more closely.
Thanks, Elena. So this leads us to the focus of the paper, which is how do we expect the scientific approach to impact the performance of entrepreneurial firms and of different firms in particular. So we're going to look at the impact of a scientific approach on performance first. If you could please go to the next slide. And we have a baseline hypothesis. What we are expecting, building on literature on strategy, entrepreneurship, decision-making, and organizational learning, is that overall this scientific approach will improve this process of iteration that entrepreneurs usually go through. This will result in better decisions and in better performance. And we expect this because we are considering what the scientific approach does as entrepreneurs are making decisions. On the one hand, as Elena was describing, the scientific approach is very beneficial because entrepreneurs have a mental model, they have a theory, and this implies that they have a clear representation of the problem they're facing, and they're then able to articulate hypotheses. What theory and hypotheses do is that they lead to more precise tests. They're basically spotlighting what are the key assumptions that entrepreneurs have and that they need to test in order to make sure that their business is viable. Now, this increased precision results in tests which are more focused and therefore are more likely to result in learning. In addition to that, the entrepreneurs are also gathering evidence that they are evaluating in a very systematic manner. And so what evaluation does is that it helps entrepreneur, first of all, understand whether the evidence is supporting their initial assumptions, but also it's very beneficial when entrepreneurs do not find evidence actually support their hypothesis, which happens quite frequently. And when that is the case, the fact that entrepreneurs have a clear framework is actually very beneficial in helping them in understanding what to do next. So for these reasons, we're expecting that a scientific approach will have a positive effect on decision-making and performance. Now, we are also interested, as we mentioned earlier, in understanding what happens with firms that are at different levels of business development. And what do we mean by that? We have looked at the literature, and interestingly, when it comes to entrepreneurship is often thought about as a journey that requires firms to go through various steps and go through an evolution process. So you can think of an entrepreneurial firm as some scholars have used the parallel of the human life. So when a firm is born, like a baby, is not fully formed. It's in a very embryonic stage, if you will, which we can consider the startup phase, which is also described as a progressing nascent venture. But these can progress over time, going all the way to a more established phase where the firm becomes a more sustainable and continued market participant. Now, the reason why this level of business development, and this is the construct that we're focusing on here, is particularly important is because these firms are in fact facing different problems. The fact that the firm is more or less developed actually implies that they've conducted slightly different activities, but they're facing different problems. And the fact that they're facing different problems has important repercussions for the type of decisions that they're making. To make this a little bit more concrete, let me provide some definitions and also give an example. When we are looking at firms that are lower level of development, and remember that this concept is a continuum. So the example that we have here is just a simplification. So we're providing an example of a low and high level, but of course there is a continuum. You can think of a firm with a low level of development as a firm that is still quite early on in the process of new venture creation, and so doesn't have a particularly well-defined value proposition just yet. On the other hand of the spectrum, you can have a firm which is at a higher level of business development, meaning that it's later on in the stage of development as a firm. And this means that the value proposition is more defined, and so the entrepreneur is more fine-tuning this value proposition. Now, to be very specific, let's look at an example. And the example that we have here is one simple business idea. Help busy individuals stay fit. So these are people who usually don't have time to go to the gym or attend some classes. So you can have an entrepreneur that is trying to develop this business idea. And here we have images that represent these two different levels of development. On the left-hand side, what you are seeing is the low level of development where the entrepreneur has not decided yet how she's going to deliver this value to the customer. This could happen through sessions which are close to, for instance, a park where the person lives. They could be delivered online, or they could be offered through a gym in a van. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing is that the entrepreneur instead has decided that the offer will happen through a gym in a van. And so this gives you a sense of what it means to have a more or less developed business idea. Now, what this does is that it implies that these firms, as we were talking earlier about the level of development, are facing different problems. And in particular, when we're looking at firms which have a lower level of business development, they're facing broader problems. By their very own nature, these problems are more open, they're more complex, there are more aspects that need to be taken into account. So in this case, what we are expecting, building on literature on organizational learning in particular, is that there will be more ambiguous learning and a slower pace of feedback, which is something that usually happens when actors are dealing with problems, actions, and consequences, which are quite broad in scope. As a consequence, this implies that it's going to be harder for these entrepreneurs to learn because the information that are emerging will be noisier. On the other side, when we're looking at a higher level of business development instead, what happens is that these firms have different types of problems that they're facing. They are narrower in scope. And what happens when actors are facing narrow problems is that the process of decision-making is simplified. And this implies that it will be easier for these entrepreneurs to apply the scientific approach. And here you can think of some studies like Etiraj and Levinthal, but also Philippe Cesar, that show how when you simplify this landscape of decision-making, for instance, by keeping some aspects of decision-making constant and just veering some aspects of the problems to change, then these results in simplified processes of decision-making and more effective decision-making. So the argument is that there will be enhanced learning for these firms which are at a more advanced level of business development. And so for these reasons, we're expecting that the level of business development is moderating positively the impact of a scientific approach on performance. How do we test these ideas? Well, we ran a field experiment, as it was alluded to earlier with the title, and we use actually business support program to run this experiment. You can see some pictures here from the study. You can see Elena, myself, the entrepreneurs, the program more broadly. It was a project that was made possible thanks to generous funding from the UK government, which allowed us to create a program just for the purpose of this particular study. And this meant that we recruited research assistants, instructors, we created a demo day with investors. I'm going to provide a little bit more details about that. But most importantly, we have firms which are at various levels of business development participating to the study. Here's a review of the RCT. I'm just going to provide some high-level details of the study. Of course, there are a lot of details with experiments, so feel free to ask any questions that you might have. What we did is that we started off with a call for applications. So we created a website and we started a marketing campaign. We managed to recruit 261 firms. After that, we randomly allocated them to either a treatment or control condition. And what's important to point out here is that they both attended training. Both groups received the same amount of training for the same amount of hours with the same instructors on the same topics. The only difference is that treated entrepreneurs learned about a scientific approach and entrepreneurs in the control group didn't. As a final step, we conducted data on these entrepreneurs for about 10 months using some phone interviews, as we're going to show you more details. This is a slide that gives you a sense of the timeline of the project. The project overall from design to end lasted for 12 months, but here what you can see is that we started off the training in month 1, which was February 2019, and we ended in April 2019. During this time, we had 21 hours of training split over 7 sessions, and this is where the treatment was. After that, until December 2019, we had monthly events. The monthly events were exactly the same for the treatment and the control group. We actually ran the same event twice on different days or different times of the day to prevent these people from talking and potentially disclosing elements of the treatment. As you can see, the data collection goes on from right before the treatment started all the way until the end, which was December 2019. To give you a little bit more details about the participants, what we did, as I mentioned, we recruited firms that were at different levels of business development. There were no prerequisites in terms of industry, so we ended up with a beautiful variety in terms of the type of businesses that attended the program, from those that were interested in fashion, retail, fintech, security, environment, education, really different type of businesses. What they all had in common, however, was the size of the firm. All the firms could have at most 10 employees. And the reason why we made that particular choice is that we actually wanted whoever participated into the program to be heavily involved in the decision-making process of the firm, and this condition is more accurately met in the context of the small firms. The table that you're seeing on this slide is showing the balance checks. So as I mentioned, after recruiting these entrepreneurs, we collected some data on the firm, and then we used this to check whether the randomization actually resulted in balanced groups. And what this table is showing you is that there are no statistically meaningful differences on a range of covariates, which is looking at both aspects which are more demographic when it comes to the firm, such as what's the age, the team size, what's the gender ratio within the company, to some which have more to do with decision-making and performance. To give you some details about the treatment versus the control condition, as I mentioned earlier, we use the training in the same way for treatment and control firms, with one important difference. You can see that both the control and the treatment group are exposed to strategy frameworks, for instance, the business model canvas or balance scorecards, and also data gathering techniques. And so this includes, for instance, how do you run a survey? How do you conduct A/B testing? How do you talk to your customers? How do you conduct good customer interviews? The only difference is that the treatment group was also taught for each of these topics and each of these sessions to use a scientific approach to decision making. And so what this meant is that for each step, they had to have a very clear theory of a mental model that explained how their business generates value. They had to then develop hypotheses or testable propositions to test what their key assumptions were, and then conduct tests in a rigorous manner and evaluate the results. So to give you a better sense of how we did this in practice, the classes were highly experiential. So we had usually a fairly long lecture, so it was around 1 hour, 1.5 hours. We had various in-class activities to really make sure that the entrepreneurs would understand the content that was explained to them right away. And we got them to apply the content of the course to their business right away. So the session also included some time for the entrepreneur to apply this content to their business and their business idea while they were in class, and clarify with the instructor whether they had any questions. In the case of the first session, where we teach the business model canvas, for instance, what we did is that we teach the business model canvas to both groups. They conduct the same activities. However, there is a difference in how they're taught to use the business model canvas. The control group follows a more standard approach, which is used in a lot of universities and accelerators and business schools as well, where they learn to use the business model canvas as a representation of their business, where various elements should be connected between them, and it contains some elements that will be tested later on. In the case of the scientific approach, they still learn about the business model canvas. However, they learn that that represents the basis for their theory of their firm. And so they're asked to also and taught how to write a theory from their business model canvas. And they consider each element of the business model canvas as hypotheses that will be tested at a later stage. And then we follow this logic and implement similar changes throughout the course to make sure that the content remains the same, but the only difference is the scientific approach. And to give you also a little bit more details about the data collection process, what we did is that we follow an approach which was championed by Bloom and von Reenen in economics with their study of management practices, where we decided to conduct telephone interviews. With these telephone interviews, we had a team of research assistants that were extensively trained on a predefined interview script. All interviews were recorded, and this was helpful for us to make sure that we could provide feedback to the research assistants. And all these interviews ran for about once a month from February until December 2019. And the research assistants were asking entrepreneurs about various topics. There were both some closed-ended questions that were primarily measuring performance, such as how many revenue did your business generate in the last month? What kind of costs? Did you make any changes to your business, as we're going to see in the next few slides with the results? And then there were some more open-ended questions as well, which aimed at measuring more the decision-making process that the entrepreneurs were going through. I think this is the end of the design part, so I can leave the floor to Elena for the results.
Thank you. So let me give you an overview of what we find. So the first question that we wanted to address is whether treated entrepreneurs achieve better performance. So when it comes to estimating performance, prior research has extensively documented that firm performance is not a unidimensional construct, and that different performance measures really capture different nuances of performance. So when we look at performance, we look first of all at revenue as an established measure of performance, but we also look at firms' growth, because we know from prior work that some firms focus on growth first, because by doing this, they basically go on a better performance trajectory. So we wanted to capture both effects, and so we wanted to capture both dimensions, and therefore we look at both. Our analysis follows a classic difference in difference specification. We therefore estimate our performance variable as a function of treatment, post, which is an indicator variable that is valued as 1 for firms after the training, and the interaction between the two. So here, what we see is that when we look at size of firms, actually what we find is that the treatment had a positive effect on performance as measured as growth, in particular about a 12% increase on performance. However, interestingly, if we look at revenue, we see a non-significant effect. Now, in looking at these results, we must acknowledge that our observation window was quite limited, about 10 months, which is not necessarily a huge amount of time for a firm to observe a change in performance. Now, ideally, we would want to observe a longer time horizon, but this was not possible at the moment due to obviously funding constraints. However, to the extent that, as prior research has suggested, growth can be interpreted as an early performance measure, we could interpret this result to indicate that firms that are treated are led to invest in the size of the firm by hiring more employees and invest in the business model, and this might later on lead them to achieve a superior performance in terms of revenue as well. But we will go back to this point as we see more results. We move next to try and understand the extent to which the scientific approach benefits all firms equally. So what we do here, we use a triple difference specification. So we want to see whether the stated difference that we observed between the performance before and after the treatment for treated and control firms, how it is shaped by our key variable, which is the degree of business development. So what we see here was that if we look at different types of firms, a different degree of development, if we look at firms more developed, the treatment had an additional incremental effect on their size. So if we observed a impact of the treatment on the size of the firm of about 11%, what we see here is that one standard deviation increase in the degree of business development leads to an additional 3% increase in the size of the firm. What is extremely interesting for us is to observe what happens when we look at revenue. So you will remember that we didn't find a significant effect of the treatment of the performance as measured in terms of revenue. Now, if we make now a distinction between firms at a low level of business development and firms at a high level of business development, what we see is really interesting. We see that for firms at a very low level of business development, the treatment actually had a negative effect on revenue, in particular, a negative effect of about 30%. On the other hand, if we look at the case of firms with a high degree of business development, the treatment had a positive effect. In particular, one standard deviation increase in the degree of business development is associated with a substantial increase in the performance as measured in revenue, a 60% increase, which is obviously quite substantial. Now, the way we interpret these results is the following. We interpret these results to basically indicate that for less established firms, the method brings them back to the drawing board. And so they start using the method to work again on their business model, to work again on their value proposition, to change things, to do things perhaps differently. And essentially, we see these being represented by the fact that they invest in their company by growing the number of employees. However, they are not yet at a stage, an exploitation stage, where we see an impact on revenue. On the other hand, if we look at more established firms, these are at a stage where they are already in an exploitation phase in their business model. So they use the method differently. They use the method to fine-tune their value proposition and make even more revenue and make it basically even more successful. Now, this is very much in line with the findings of other scholars. For example, if we think about the work of Joshua Gans, Scott Stern, and colleagues, they suggest, in line with these results, that when firms are still in an early, low commitment phase, any positive signal leads them to an exploration search phase. When firms have already made significant commitment, a positive signal leads them to higher exploitation. Now, these results are also robust to winsorizing, alternative measures of development, and fixed effect specification. In a way, looking at comparing what happens to firms at a low degree of business development and firms at a high degree of business development helps us perhaps providing an answer to our earlier question about what happens in the longer term. Because what we see here is a comparison between firms that are at a different stage of the journey. So this gives us a sort of snapshot at different points in time, which might suggest that in the longer term, the method also helps firms exploiting and benefiting in terms of revenue. More in general, we are also in conversation with the government to explore the possibility of observing these firms in the longer term by basically having a longer time horizon by merging our data with the data collected by the government. So this would answer our question regarding longer term even more extensively. Of course, in the meanwhile, we had a relevant shock, which was, of course, the pandemic. But this might also offer some interesting opportunity to see whether the method made these firms, for example, more resilient. Let me show you also some model-free evidence that might give us another snapshot of what happens if we look at the data. So what we have here on the left-hand side is the average of revenue at the baseline for low firms at a low degree of development, lower than the average, and a high degree of development, higher than the average. And we compare control and treated firms. So what we see here is that the revenue of firms at a low degree of development were very similar in the control and in the treatment group. And also the revenue of firms at a high degree of development were very similar for the control and treated firms. If we observe the averages of the revenue at the end of the period, we basically see that, of course, all the revenue of all firms grew, but in the low development group, firms in the control group grew more in terms of revenue compared to treated firms, while the opposite is true in the case of firms at a higher degree of development. So this provides us another snapshot of the results that we showed in our econometric analysis. Now, we are at a stage where we are trying to provide more evidence about the mechanism that we suggest are behind our results and that we mentioned earlier. So what we have started looking at is we asked entrepreneurs before starting our program what were the issues that they faced. And what we see is that the issues that entrepreneurs at different levels of business development face are indeed different, as predicted by our theory. In particular, we have seen that firms at low levels of business development are significantly more likely to indicate at the baseline that the main issues that they face are related to product development or to the identification of the product market fit and really to the market validation. So they're really facing higher level questions which concern the nature of the business model and the value proposition. On the other hand, firms at high levels of business development were significantly more likely at the baseline to indicate that the main issues that they were facing were relating to expanding the business and customer base. So this is very much in line with our interpretation of the findings that the scientific method helped entrepreneurs at a lower stage of development to address questions that were probably broader and that concerned the value proposition. But in line with this, the outcome of that application of the method didn't necessarily lead them to obtain immediately revenue, but probably to improve their business model, to grow the strength of that business model as represented by an increase in the number of employees. Similarly, we are also conducting some text analysis regarding the way in which these entrepreneurs talked about their value proposition at the baseline. And what we are seeing is that entrepreneurs at a lower degree of business development were significantly more likely at the baseline to describe their value proposition in a way that expressed a higher degree of uncertainty and hesitation. We also try to provide evidence of the mechanisms by looking at what these entrepreneurs do after the training. And in particular, we look at the extent to which they make changes to their value proposition. So to do so, we use the business model canvas as a way of representing the entrepreneurial business model. And I'm sure that this audience is quite familiar with the business model canvas and the fact that it's composed by different elements, for example, the value proposition, customer segment, customer relationships, and so on. So we look at whether entrepreneurs made any changes during the observation window to any elements of the business model canvas. And we also look at the extent to which these changes were radical versus incremental. And consistently with our theory and our interpretation of the results, what we see is that firms at high levels of business development are significantly more likely to engage in incremental versus radical pivot. Once again, in line with the idea that entrepreneurs at a low stage of development use the method to go back to the drawing board and reconsider the way they're doing business, but this does not necessarily lead them immediately to observe revenue. On the other hand, firms that are at a more advanced stage of development have a more established value proposition, so use the method to improve it, to fine-tune it. And so they're already making revenue, and this leads them to essentially make even more revenue. We also try to exclude alternative explanations. For example, one that we considered was that maybe these results that was associated with a higher or lower degree of business development was perhaps driven by the experience of entrepreneurs in the industry, or experience in running startups, or managerial experience. But none of these explanations was related to our results. None of these alternative explanations essentially held. Alternatively, we thought maybe this is confidence that is really driving these results. Maybe the more developed firms are more confident, and so maybe this is what is actually driving our results. But once again, we also ruled out this alternative explanation. So to conclude, what we find is that overall, treated firms grow more than control firms. And if we look at the distinction when it comes to performance as measured in terms of revenue, if we look at the distinction between less developed and more developed businesses, what we see is that less developed business actually, for them, the treatment has a negative effect on performance, but it has a very positive effect on performance for more developed businesses. Now, we believe that these results contribute to existing literature on decision-making and strategy by showing an important boundary conditions for the application of the scientific decision-making approach, and more in general about systematic approaches to decision-making. And in particular, it also highlights the complementarity between the development of a theory about the firm and experimentation, which is in contrast with the idea that entrepreneurs can really delay important choices and experiment at any stage of their journey. We also believe that these results have important practical implications, and they provide actionable tools for entrepreneurs. We are in the process of developing some case studies as well, and tools for entrepreneurs. We also believe that there's an important practical implication that is particularly dear to us as educator, in addition to being scholars, which is basically that these results show that it's not just the content that we teach in the classroom that makes the difference, but it's also the way in which the content, it's also about teaching students or entrepreneurs how to use that content. Because if we think about it, what we delivered in our control classroom was very similar to what we deliver in any management course. But the difference in the treatment in this case was really about teaching entrepreneurs not only the tools, but also how to use them to develop a theory, how to use them to test the theory. So we believe this is something that is relevant for us as educators. So what are the next steps? We have presented today this paper, but this paper is really part of a larger project titled Scientific Approach to Innovation Management that we are conducting together with Alfonso Gambardella, Arnaldo Camuffo, and other colleagues at Bocconi, at the University of Maryland, at Erasmus, at the University of Les Andes, at the India School of Business, Coin University, and Shanghai University. More in general, what we are trying to do with this project is that of understanding and answering a broader question, which is what type of decision-making processes can help firms navigate uncertainty. And we hope with this project to be able to explore the antecedents associated with these decision-making processes and the implications. So we are in the process of setting up multiple randomized controlled trials in different countries: Italy, the Netherlands, the UK, Colombia, Brazil, China, India, and Tanzania. And we hope that this will give us the opportunity to further validate the robustness of the results, but also to explore other nuances and boundary conditions to improve our knowledge about decision-making in the context of uncertainty. So I would like to thank you very much, and I will pause here and look forward to any feedback and suggestions. Thank you.
So Elena, we actually have one question in the chat. So maybe we can start with that one. And then in the meantime, if people think about any other questions, we can take them. So since we are live online, Ziyan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, yeah. Thanks, Elena and Chiara, for the wonderful research. It's very interesting and rigorous. So I just have a quick question regarding the H2, especially in terms of the theory. So I think the research argument now centers on the benefits of scientific approach, but it also has the cost side of that approach. For the higher development of business, it also means that it's more costlier for them to adopt that approach because they have larger sunk costs if they use that approach. So I wonder if that also means the higher development also means they are unlikely to employ a scientific approach in reality, and that would also lead to the opposite prediction. So it's about whether they use it or not, rather than the approach is beneficial or not.
Thank you for this question. We also look at costs actually in some supplementary analysis. And what we see is that indeed, the scientific approach leads more developed firms to basically higher expenses. So it is more expensive, like they spend more when they use the scientific approach. So this is in line with the prediction that the scientific approach leads to higher costs, not necessarily higher sunk costs, but certainly higher costs. We also look at whether the value added, so whether essentially, because we see an increase in revenue, and we see an increase in cost. So a follow-up question could be, is it possible that the increase in revenue is simply driven by the increase in cost? And so the value is simply transferred to the customer. There's no value retention for the firm. And what we see is that we see an effect on value added. So the scientific method leads more developed firms to also generate more value, which we believe is quite interesting. I hope that answers your question.
Let me also
thank you.
Add something about, right, because I think Elena was right in talking a lot about empirics, but this is also a conceptual point, right? And so the literature that looks at business development is really emphasizing how the level of development is not related to, for instance, age or cost. So of course, I think the example which we showed might have primed you in that way because that shows two extremes on the continuum. But usually the level of development is really about what are the problems that these firms are facing. And so costs, and especially sunk costs, which are irreversible, might not really be central in that particular case. But I think it's interesting what you're pointing out about sort of what is the cost of using a scientific approach, right? So I think this is also a very interesting question for future research. I see that we also have a question in the chat and we have a hand raised, and I believe that the hand was raised first. So why don't we hear from Alexander? We cannot hear you, Alexander. Oh, it was a mistake. Okay. So there is another question in the chat from Alfonso. Alfonso, would you like to unmute yourself?
Okay, just very simply, I would be curious to know, how do you rule out that higher developed firms are not just more skilled or experienced to adopt the approach?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for the question. So what we look at is whether the experience of more developed firms I mean, obviously more developed firms are also tend to be more experienced. And we basically try to see whether the effect that we observe is explained by experience, so whether experience leads to the same outcome, and we don't see that. So we don't find that more experienced firms have a more positive like result when they use the approach. On the other hand, when we look at the level of development, we see the effect. Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you. I see Addis being spotlighted. Addis, do you have a question?
Yes, I actually left the question on the Q&A part, and there's a chat, so I think it was not clear. So it was an interesting presentation. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Okay.
Addis.
Hello. Good to see you, and it is an excellent project. So I have just one simple clarification question. So when you go on the post hoc analysis, identifying the mechanisms, you mentioned a few mechanisms that kind of distinguish less developed and more developed businesses. And it felt to me more like they are the characteristics of the business themselves than mechanisms. So I was kind of, yeah, can you say a little more? For instance, you say in less developed business ideas, owners were not very sure, they had certain uncertainty. And I felt that was the very definition of less developed business idea. So how do you kind of differentiate between the nature of the business idea itself, so it's not developed, versus the mechanism by which, the treatment helps them to, to perform better?
So just to check that we understood the question, we understood the premise. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on the question, please?
So yeah, my question is, are the characteristics of the business idea, so highly developed versus less developed business idea, different from the mechanism you say as drivers for the performance outcome you observe? So I kind of see a mix between the characteristic of the business ideas and the mechanisms that connect the business ideas to the success, the performance initially.
Okay, so let me elaborate a bit on that, on the answer to this question, and Chiara maybe can elaborate, and then you will tell us whether it answers or not your question. So essentially our idea is that firms at a different level of business development face different problems. So firms at a lower degree of business development are still validating the value proposition. And this is the first point that you were suggesting. And firms at a later stage are fine-tuning the value proposition. So your question is, we understand that these are the two characteristics. Tell us more about the mechanism. And the idea for us is that for firms that they are still developing the value proposition, the method helps them make some higher level decisions, which can be, what is the customer, the target customer that we want to face. So obviously, the method at this stage is relevant. It helps them decide, but this is like one out of several important choices that they're making. So this might lead them to make more investments in a certain customer segment. It might lead them to hire someone who is an expert in that customer segment, but it might not necessarily translate into revenue immediately. The other thing that we are also thinking about in terms of the mechanism is that this is like a search process in like a broader space, because there are still many degrees of freedom. So the entrepreneur has to go to, the scientific method works in an iterative way. So obviously the theory is further developed over time through these iterations. And so when there are still many high degrees of freedom, first of all, it takes more time to cover the search space, but also each test can be in a way less informative because or let's put it this way, it might be more difficult to run all the, like to develop the theory and run all the different tests. Because if you think about the number of combinations that this entails, is actually quite high. On the other hand, if you compare the opposite situation, high degree of business development, very fine-tuned proposition, the search space is much smaller. So the method, in terms of mechanism, to answer your question about the mechanism, can be applied in a much more focused way. And so it quickly serves in providing answers that are like the missing pieces of the puzzle. And then, there is a complete picture, which is the finalized, fine-tuned value proposition, which can directly generate revenue. I don't know if Chiara wants to add anything to this.
Sure. I think what I'd like to add is that I think Adis went straight to the most difficult part of any field experiment, which is showing what the mechanism is. And obviously, as this presentation shows, these are preliminary results. So this is really the part of this project where Elena and I are spending more time now. So really trying to show more clearly what is the journey that these firms are going through. So I think, as you mentioned, the idea with the problems is not so much to show that they are the mechanism, but rather to show that that's the starting condition. So these firms actually face different problems, which is something that is consistent with the literature. But then the mechanism are these different changes that they're making. So we're trying to work more on pivot and other intermediate outcomes to show that a little bit more clearly. So I think this question is very helpful for us to really clarify that we need to focus on that a little bit more. And I think that this point is also closely related to the question that Miriam has that I see in the chat. Miriam, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Good.
Hello.
Yes, my question is very much related to the previous one, and so the first part of my question actually is a comment, and it's to make sure that I understood basically the main conclusions of the paper, which is one size basically does not fit all. So it depends on the stage of the business cycle of the specific firm, how this firm adopts the scientific method, the cognitive method, and it depends on the outcomes that you're looking at. Now I don't. My point here is whether it's about the way the different firms, according to the stage of the business development, use the scientific method that is different, or whether they make different decisions because they are in a different stage of the business cycle, and therefore they have to make decisions that are different compared to firms that are more like ahead in terms of the scientific, in terms of the business development. So if you want, my question is confused because it's not clear to me what somehow what I want to ask, but so whether this is an issue concerning the way firms use the scientific method, whether it's a matter of the decisions that different firms at the different stage have to make. So what comes first here that explains your finding?
Yeah, I think it's a very clear question. Actually, it's not confused at all. So maybe I can start, and then Elena, please feel free to add, because it's quite a broad question anyway. So I really like how you summarize this idea of one size doesn't fit all, which might be one of the key takeaways. And I think elaborating on this point, what is interesting is that, especially for policymakers, for accelerators, for us as educators, this suggests that there might be better ways to help these entrepreneurs, which are really early in their journey of developing a new business. Now, I think the caveat also that we need to keep in mind when we interpret these results is that the study has a fairly limited duration, right? So precisely for the reasons that you're discussing about the different type of problems, it might be that these early stage entrepreneurs need more time to reach a stage where we can really see the benefits of using a scientific approach. And so the fact that they're facing these different problems might imply that they need more time. So hopefully this is something that we will be able to measure later on at some point, as Elena mentioned earlier, with additional data. But I think this is an important caveat and something that we're thinking about in terms of how to interpret the results in a fairly cautious way. But Elena, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. What comes first, problems, decisions?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Miriam. It's obviously a very important question. And I particularly think that from a practical standpoint, your suggestion in the chat of looking at intermediate decisions, because I mean, essentially what we are saying here is also that between growing the firm, like defining the value proposition, and making revenues and exploiting that value proposition, there's really a lot. And so it would be really nice to be able to map the data generation process there, with possibly looking at intermediate outcomes. So this is in fact why we in the following studies, these are things that hopefully we will have the opportunity to observe, so that it will provide additional evidence in this direction. With this specific study, we obviously are limited to what we measured. So we are trying to provide some evidence in that direction, but it's certainly it's certainly the direction to go in, because it's a very important opportunity to map the decision-making process and understand more about how, about the process that goes from making the decision to observe some intermediate outcome and then investing more until the performance is observed. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're coming very close to the end of the session. So I'll leave it to Emily or Ryan to wrap up. But what I want to say for sure is that I would like to thank everyone for being with us today and taking the time to attend our presentation. And we would really love to hear any thoughts, any ideas or suggestions. So please feel free to reach out to us. And we would be delighted to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.